1, 2, 3, go! Sige. How about Facebook? Is it live na?
Ah? Bakit ganun?
Hindi pa live sa Facebook? Sa YouTube okay na? Sige.
Sige na dyan.
Hindi dapat sabay kasi sila eh.
Bakit ganun? Gano'n sa Facebook? Andyan.
Okay na?
May sinanda ako sa yung stream key ulit.
Okay, okay.
Nagpapalit yun.
So wait, let's set this up first. Settings. Let's see. Copy. Live. Start streaming. Okay na? Is it active? Good na? Sige na, you can go live na din. YouTube okay na? So, mag-sign ka na lang next kapag okay na. Active na?
Wait lang. Okay na.
Okay na? So we're up and running na? Okay, so good na? Good na sa Facebook? Good na? Not yet? Okay na? Okay na, Jace? Sige. So, pwede na tayo mag-start. So, hello everyone and good morning. So, this is me, Joshua from Pixel8, and I welcome you to Pixel8's Basic Software Training Program. So, we apologize for the bit of delay. We were having some technical difficulties while setting up the live stream. So, now that all is going now, or now that everything is up and running, so we can now proceed with our training. So, before we begin, please do make sure that you let your colleagues or your friends know about this live stream so that we can reach more viewers, so that we can also teach more people regarding the technologies that we use here at Pixel8. So, for today's discussion, what we will be discussing is VueJs. So, we will be tackling VueJs for today, for the entire day rather. So, for this morning, what we're going to tackle is the basics of VueJs. For the basics, what we will be tackling is how VueJs works, what VueJs is, its functionalities, as well as how we can code using VueJs. But before all of that, we need to first set up our environment, which was discussed in our previous live stream session. So, for those of you who are for those of you who are new to the live stream or was not able to attend the previous live stream, what we will be doing first is we need to set up our environment first for creating a VueJs application. So we will be providing a handout for you in terms of we will be providing a VueJs handout for you in order to use it, as well as to guide you on how to set up your VueJs environment. In the handouts also, we will include some example code, as well as some sample snippets and as well as commands on how to install and then set up VueJs itself. So we will be providing you with the links down below later. So aside from that, we will be also tackling VueJs in advance in terms of plugins, as well as the basic or the advanced usage in terms of using plugins. So what do we mean by plugins? So in terms of plugins, what we will be talking about is in specific VueX, as well as View Router. So in the afternoon session, we will be tackling those two as well as what components are. So those are the topics that we will be handling in the afternoon session. But before we jump into those, we need to start first with the basics. And so, to begin this training, we will now be starting with VueJs. So, before we begin with the lecture itself, we need to first set up our VueJs environment. So, we will be providing you with the link to the handouts itself in order for you to follow along as well as to guide you into setting up your VueJs environment. So, okay. So, as you can see, we have here a training handout, or we will give you a training handout. So this link will be provided to you in the comment section below. We will be sharing them with you in order for you to view these training handouts. So in order to, or rather, guiding you, in order to guide you into, or rather, what we call this, to give you a basic rundown of the handout. What it contains is commands for setting up VueJs. So first, what you need to do is you need to install Node.js. You might ask, what is Node.js? So Node.js is a system that allows JavaScript to run alongside the machine itself. So it gives us much more capabilities aside from rendering into the browser itself. So we now have access to the machine itself, not just the browser. So after that, you will also notice that we provided in the handouts the installation of Git, which was previously tackled in the previous live stream. So in this case, why we added Git here is because we will be using our Git repository, which was used previously in order to implement our VueJs code. So next, what you need to install is VueCLI. So in order to install VueCLI, you need to first install Node.js and then use that to install VueCLI itself as a global component. Next, in preparation for the afternoon session, we will be installing in advance the VueX as well as View Router inside the project that we will be creating. And then next, you will see the commands for creating a project as well as running a project. Also, you will see in the handout some some basic components, which are, as you can see right here. We will be sharing them with you in order for you to try them as well as to implement them yourselves. Later on, if we have time, we will be tackling these as well, and then we will be implementing them ourselves. So you have a lot of basic, basic functionalities for VueJs. Aside from those, you also have this component lifecycle, which we will be tackling later on. We will be explaining to you how what a Vue lifecycle is. Aside from those, you also have lifecycle hooks, which are hooks that are inserted based on your current lifecycle. So we will be explaining all of this later on. You also have computed methods, and then you have computed properties as well as methods. So you have some short descriptions here as well as sample code. So all of these materials will be provided to you in order to help you with your VueJs development. So you have sample code here for passing data to child component, as well as you have examples for passing from and to every component. So once we clear that up, what we'll be using next is VueX. So as you can see here, we have VueX. VueX will be handled in our afternoon session. So you will also see in the handouts the basic, you have a guide here for guiding you as well as to tell you what to do, and then you also have a description for the core concepts here. You have states, getters, mutations, actions, and modules. So later on, we will be tackling them as well. So, okay. So, aside from that, we also have the setting up of state, getters, mutations, as well as actions. So, for the view router, we will be tackling them also. So, in a later part of our in our discussion, view router will be tackled as well. So, we will be explaining to you what view router does and what it can do to your application to make it behave as a single page application. So, we also have here how to set up view router. We also here have how to add routes, dynamic routes, as well as programmatic navigation. So we have all of these prepared for you in order to guide you in your VueJs development. So with that in mind, we will now be you can now proceed with the basic VueJs training itself. So, okay, very good. So, now that we have that out of the way, are the links posted already? Posted na po ba sila? Yung document para sa handout?
Wala pa natin.
Okay. Yung alam mo kung nasan sila, Jay? Sige. So, okay. So, wait a minute. So, with that in mind, we can now proceed to setting up the VueJs environment. So, starting with that, what we need to first do is install Node.js, right? So, the first step would be to install Node.js. So, how would you install Node.js? So, in order to demonstrate, you simply need to head over to nodejs.org. And then once we go through here, you simply need to click the LTS version. We recommend LTS in order so that your Node.js build is a stable one, so we don't have that much complications when it comes to development. Now, once you have your node up and running, what you need to do next is to do the following. Now that you have your Node.js up and running, you simply open a terminal for us to install the VueJs CLI. So, once you have your node up and running, you simply type npm space install space -g, and then you type @vue-cli. So, in order to demonstrate, we simply need to head to Vue CLI, which is this one right here. So all of these URLs are provided in the handouts for you to follow along. So once you follow along that, once you go with the URLs themselves, you will see that they have this command as an installation guide. So see, we simply need to copy this command and then to run it in our terminal. So if we do that, we now have this command, right? So what we need to do is you simply copy the command and then we paste it on the terminal or on our terminal, and then we press enter. Now, while it is installing, what we need to do next is to install Git. So for those of you who have not installed Git yet, you may head over to Git, if I'm correct, git-scm. So you can head over to that link, or you can refer to the handouts to go to the download link or to go to the website and then to hit the download button. So now that we have our Git up and running, what we're going to do after we set up the Git is we need to create a project on that Git repository. So meanwhile, while the VueCLI is still installing, we will head over to our repository. So we proceed to, let's say, here. So let's create a folder around it. So test, let's say test. So here, we have an empty folder, right? So what we need to do first is to clone the repository that we were using in our previous live stream. So for those of you who are not yet or just came to this live stream for the first time, we will be sending you the link as well to the GitLab repository that we will be using. So we need to head over to GitLab. So the link for this URL, or rather we will provide the link to this URL in order for you to follow along as well. So this is a public repository, so you can view it anytime. So once we have this repository up and running, or we have this GitLab website now, what we need to do next is to clone this in our local environment. So in order to clone this, you simply need to click this button right here, which is the clone with HTTPS option. And then once we got that done, we need to head over to our folder here, which is our empty directory of choice, or for those of you who want to use a different folder, you may do so, as long as it is empty. So what we need to do here is we need to open a terminal. So we open a terminal here. What we're going to do next is we're going to type git space clone, and then we paste the link itself. So one way of pasting the link is to simply hit right click in your terminal. Now once you got that down, you simply press enter. And then we wait for Git to clone the repository. So for those of you who might be encountering errors or issues, one common issue with GitLab is you may not be able to pull the repository in case you don't have an account. So that's one common error that we have. So in order to prevent that, you simply need to register an account to gitlab.com, which is this website right here. You need to create an account for GitLab. Next, once you have an account for GitLab, in order for you to push your branches to the repository itself, you need to contact us in order for us to add you to the repository itself. So you simply need to add you simply need to tell us your GitLab username, and that's all we need in order to add you to this repository. So for the purposes of this training, we will be using this repository for the entire duration. For the previous session that we had in the live, or for the previous training session, what we did was we created this repository as well as introduce you to the basics of Git. So for those of you who are new to the live stream, you may refer to that previous session in order to guide you in using Git as well as to catch up along. So it's always up and running, so you don't have to worry about that. So now that let's see. So now we have cloned our GitLab repository, right? So if we head over to our directory, you will see that we have a GitLab repository right here, right? So we need to simply head over to that directory, and then we need to type git space branch. So for now, you will see that we have a main branch. So in order to get all the branches, we need to simply type git fetch. But since I think we cloned the entire repository, we already have all of them. So heading over back to GitLab, you will see that we have several branches already up and running here. So you will notice that we have a branch for activity 1. So for those of you who would like to participate with the activity 1, we will also provide the link, the activity 1, in order for you to do that as well. Also, for the purposes of the basic training as well, we will have an activity, or we will have another branch suited exactly for the activity in VueJs. So now that we have our GitLab, or now that we have our Git up and running, we can now check back to our VueCLI installation. So just in time, so we now finished our installation of VueCLI. Now, in order to check that your VueCLI is up and running, you simply need to type view and then press enter. So what view will return to you is a help text. So as you can see here, you now have a VueCLI up and running. So now that we have our Git up and running, as well as we now have our VueCLI ready to be used, let's jump first to Git in order to set up our environment. So for the Git, or rather later on in the activity, we will be giving you instructions as to how to set up your Git repo or your Git branch in order to comply with the activity, as well as the instructions for the Gitlab or for the Vue application that you're going to create. So yes, you heard it right. We will be creating our own applications. So for the purposes of this training, we need to first set up our environment. So now that we have our Vue CLI up and running, we simply head over to any repository, or rather any blank directory of our choice, and then we need to add a folder. So let's name it as Vue app, something like that. So any name will do as well. So we simply head on inside the folder, and then we open a terminal. Now that we have our terminal up and running, we simply need to use the following command. So we need to type Vue space create, and then simply type a folder name. So if you take a look at the training handouts, scroll this back upwards. In order to create a project, you simply type Vue space create, and then the app name itself or the folder name. So that's what we're going to do as well. So Vue create, let's say Vue app. So we simply now wait for the Vue to initialize our project. So while initializing the project, you will notice there will be a set of options that will appear in the terminal as we're setting up the Vue application. So this is what you're going to see in your first Vue setup. So you simply need to select the Vue tool. Now you might ask, why Vue tool? For the purposes of this training, we will be using Vue tool in order to make sure that the plugins that we're using later on in the advanced training or in the advanced training module, which is the VueJs as well as Vue router, those two modules are compatible with Vue 2 for now. So for later on, we're going to upgrade them once they are already up and running and have their own stable versions. So for now, we're going to settle with Vue 2. So we simply select Vue 2. And then it's going to ask you for the package manager you want to use. So in this case, we're going to use npm. You may also use yarn if you like. So you might ask, what is yarn? Yarn is basically the same with npm, but in terms of performance, yarn is much better compared to npm. But since we have npm up and running already, we will be using npm instead. So while the CLI is building up our VueJs app, we can head over to our, we can now head over to discussing first what the training handouts contains. So it's just a short overview. So later on, as we discuss and as we go along, we will be tackling all of these things. So you have a complete guide here, or the basic rundown of a VueJs application. So you have class binding, you have input binding, you have also element visibility, you have event handling, you also have conditional rendering. So you have all of these capabilities built into VueJs. So what that means is your VueJs is not just a simple application as you might think it is. So it's not just HTML combined with JavaScript. So it's not like that at all. So what do we mean by that? What it means is your VueJs app is not just a static content, it is dynamic as well as reactive. So later on in our discussion, we will be discussing what those two mean. So, and why VueJs is like that. So let's see. Oh, it's not this one, so the other terminal. So while it is installing, I think we can now proceed to our discussion. So now that our VueJs is now that our VueJs environment is still installing because it's going to take some time based on your, it depends on your machine. So for those of you who have faster machines, this process can be just a short one. But for those with a bit slower machines, this can take up some time. So while the environment is still prepping up, we can now proceed to our discussion. So let's, okay. So there it is. And then there it is. So again, rather, okay, let's see. Okay, so again, good morning, and it is I, Joshua Haji, your software engineer supervisor here at Pixel8, and then we're going to discuss this time VueJs. So beautiful view, isn't it? I think so. So in our case, it is indeed a beautiful view, not just figuratively but literally. So, okay, I apologize. It's the temperatures. Is it noisy?
Yes.
Okay, so let's try and tame it down. It really is noisy. Okay, so there are, I think, a laptop's gonna toast if we turn it on. Okay na. The fan, the laptop fan is a bit noisy. Kasi it's rendering twice. So anyway, so going back. So you might ask, what is Vue? So now that we have the technology, we shall now ask the question, what is that technology? So again, going back to the question, what is Vue? So we're going to answer that question. So Vue is a progressive framework for building user interfaces. What do we mean by progressive? Progressive in Vue's definition means it can be plugged into any part of existing code. So what do you mean by that? Imagine that you have an HTML website, right? So imagine that you have a header, a body, as well as a footer. So that's the basic layout of a website, right? So, okay, so thank you. Okay, pardon. Let's just set up this cooling pad because the laptop is quite noisy. Okay. Apologies for the mishap. Oops. Okay. Oh. So going back, I think it's okay. So let's set up the camera first. Let's see, is it good? Okay, so it's perfectly fine. Okay, so thank you guys. So again, so going back. Oh, okay. So what do we mean by progressive? It can be plugged into any part of existing code, right? So what it means is simply, if you have an existing HTML code, let's say a header part, you also have a footer part as well as the body part, you can plug your VueJs app to that application without, let's see. You can plug your VueJs application directly to that page without changing your code at all. So you might ask, how is that possible? VueJs itself is just a framework, meaning it is just a JavaScript file that we attach to any website. So that means you can plug your VueJs applications anywhere as long as it has an ID. So later on we will be discussing that part. Also, VueJs library focuses on the Vue layer only. So in terms of the Vue layer, what it does is it only manipulates the Vue layer. So for the Vue layer, what you can kind of imagine it as the it's the part where it's the part that you can see in a browser. So that's what it modifies only. So that's what it focuses on. Okay, so aside from that, VueJS can also power sophisticated single-page applications. So you might ask, what is a single-page application? So for those of you who don't know what a single-page application is, it is an application that requires no refresh whenever you change a path. So what does it mean? So every time you click a link, it redirects, right? So it loads a new page. So for the single page applications, that is not the case. What happens is you only load the page once and then the application never refreshes anymore. So that's what it means when you have a single page application. Meaning, you simply swap components based on the route you want to take. So that is what a single page application is. So you might, of course, you will be asking the question, why Vue? If you consider the other frameworks, you also see the same question. So you will be asking, why Vue? Well, in our case, we want to teach you Vue because of these 6 features or these 6 reasons. First is the easy learning curve. VueJS is not that difficult to learn at all. It has an easy learning curve, so that means you won't encounter that much issues when developing VueJS applications. Next is scalability. For the scalability, VueJS can be easily scaled based on the context as well as based on what you as a developer needs in an application. For flexibility, VueJS can handle DOM changes as well as handle data changes easily without breaking that much. So that is what we mean by flexibility. You can plug it to any content, you can plug it anywhere, you can plug it simply as it is, or you can create a standalone for it. Simplicity. Next, you have simplicity, right? So Vue is not that complicated when you see it, or rather when you apply it to yourself, or if you use it yourself. It only has 3 sections per component. So later on we will be discussing those. Also, community. As of now, you have if you check the GitHub repository of VueJS, or if you check the community of VueJS, it has a lot of members and it is still growing. So with a large community, you won't have problems that much in terms of maintenance. So we won't be encountering that much issues. As well as we have several other people who are having the same issues aside from us. So lastly is reactivity. So reactivity is something that VueJS can do. So you might ask, what is reactivity? Reactivity is a feature of a VueJS that allows you to change content on the fly. So later on we will be showing you how it works. So how does it work? So here you can see a basic VueJS component file. A VueJS file, or rather a VueJS file consists only of 3 sections. You have the template, you have the script, and then you have the style. So for the template block, that is where we will add the HTML elements of our component. For the script block, we will use that block for JavaScript code. Also, the script block uses the Vue script syntax in order to implement its own functionalities. And then for the style block, it is used for CLS or for CSS styling. Also, CSS styles are applied only to this specific component. So that is one powerful feature of VueJS, meaning you can add styles to the component alone without affecting the other components' styles. So in a sense, you have a sense of isolation between your components. So VueJs also has what you call the declarative rendering. So for those of you who are not yet, or for those of you who have never encountered the, let's say, the term yet, declarative rendering is a system that enables Vue to declaratively render data to the DOM. What it does is it links data and the DOM under the hood, therefore making the DOM reactive. So what do you mean by that? So example here, you have a simple component, right? So what we did here is we have a message block, right? So in the top corner, you will see that we have this message block rendered here. So what it does is, rather what this means is we're binding the message variable in the script to the DOM itself, as you can see right here. So if you see the arrows, what it says here is that the message value is set. Now once we set the value, the DOM re-renders and use the updated value without doing anything at all. So that means upon loading of the component, the data is already binded to the DOM, meaning whatever your data content is, that is what appears in your DOM as well. So in order to demonstrate, that, don't see. Okay, so now that we have our Vue CLI up and running, we now head to running our Vue application. So just in time with our discussion. So in order to run our Vue application, we simply need to use the following command, as you can see in the handouts. So simply need to use the Vue npm run serve, right? So before we do that though, we need to edit something first in our application. So we need to head over to the application we created, and then we're going to edit the package.json. So we need to edit this file. So we open this with Notepad. For now, let's use Notepad. So then, now that you have this line right here, you will see in the handout that you need to edit line 6. So you simply copy this command here, and then we replace line 6 with that one. So we count from here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you edit this serve line right here. So we grab this one, and then we replace them with this one right here, and then we hit save. Once we do that, we now proceed to running the application itself. So we simply type npm space run, and then we type serve. What it's going to do is it's going to serve the application there. Okay, so we need to get inside. I'm in the wrong direction. So we need to type npm run and then serve. So what it's going to do is it's going to start a development server that we will use in order to develop our application. Also, it features what you call a hot reloading. So what do you mean by hot reloading? Hot reloading is a feature that allows you to develop code on the fly without refreshing the application itself. So if we head over to this link, we simply go to, let's close this now for now. So we head over to localhost 880. So what you're going to get, or what you're going to be greeted with, is the VueJs app itself. So now that we have our VueJs app up and running, we now go to our favorite, or we now open this directory itself with our IDE of choice. We can open it using Sublime, or in our case, we're going to use PHP Storm. So you can use an IDE of your choice, but for those of you who can, or rather for those of you who want different IDEs, there's no problem with that. So IDE choice is a matter of personal preference. So my fan is loud again. So I apologize for that. So once we have that, we're going to open, and then we're going to head to our test directory. So we need to head over to temp. Oops, wrong. So open the wrong project. So simply open it again. And okay, let's use Sublime instead. Okay. So we need to open our directory here, right? So we need to open a project of our choice. So we click open. So we head over to our test directory here. So let's find it. Temp. Then we proceed to this one. Oh no, it's not this one. It's here. Yes. Okay. So this one. So now that we have our project up and running, we simply now wait for it to load. So I apologize. Okay, so it's now loading. So now you can see that we have a VueJs app right now. So while waiting for it to load, okay, let's wait for it to load for now. What we're going to do is, you will notice that the package.json is edited, right? So now that we have edited the package JSON, we now have a basic VueJs app. So to give you a basic run through, the public is where we will add the tab icon and the index.html. So it is the public directory. But what we're going to focus on is the source directory. So you will see that you have the application right here. You have assets here, which are the assets that you will be using in the activity or in the components themselves. You also have the components right here. So in order to demonstrate, let's edit the hello world component. So here is our app, right? So let's try removing something like this. So let's focus on the app.view first. So here you will see that you have a basic app, right? So you have a template, you have a script, which is this one, the template. You have this script right here, and then you have the style, right? So now that it's up and running, we can try editing this right now. So let's try and comment out this part first, and then hit save. And then let's remove the component here as well, and then let's remove this one. So let's hit save. So what's going to happen is, it's going to rebuild our application, and then what we're going to see is, so let's wait for it. Ooh, it's quite slow. Oh, it's still compiling. Okay, so there you go. So as you can see, the content is now gone, right? Because what we did was we removed the component. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply our own component here instead. So the first step that we need to do is we create our own component. So we simply head over to the components folder, and then we add a new view component. So let's type it as, let's say, what view first? This is the most difficult part of a developer, finding names. So let's try using index instead. So now we have an index.view, right? So as you can see, you have three sections for the index file. You have a template, which is this section right here. You have the script, which is this section, and then you have the style. So for the template, what we're going to do is, let's try adding a simple view. So now we have an HTML content, right? And then let's add an H1. Let's say hello. Something simple as that. So now we have a basic VueJs component, right? Next, in order to make it appear in our page right here, what we're going to do is we're going to import our component. So we have this import component here, right? So we simply remove the comment and then we replace hello world with index, right? Which is the file name. And then we're going to specify the file itself, which is, as you can see here, we have index from the index.view, right? And then we're going to grab this and we're going to use it here. So we remove this. So now you have index imported in our component. Next, instead of using the hello world component, we're going to replace index here. And then we remove the message. So to explain, or you might ask rather, what did we just do? So first, what we did was we created a component file, which is the index.view, which is this file right here. And then what we did was, in our main component, which is the app.view, which is the one that is rendering all of this content that you see on the screen, we imported the index component inside the app. So now you will notice that the index is imported inside the app.view, and then we declared it as a component of the application right here. Now that we have declared that as a component, we can now use it as a component itself to the template block. So what it means is, since we have declared it here, whatever the content of the index.view in the template section will also get displayed here. So that's what it means when you use components in a view instance. So now, as you can see, we have a hello, right? So hello. So now that we have our environment ready to go and up and running, we can now experiment with the handouts that we gave you in order to demonstrate what VueJs can do. So going back to the training handouts, you will see that you have reactivity here as a basic, right? So let's start with that. So what is reactivity? So in order to demonstrate, we can add a simple reactivity feature right here. So let's say we want to, let's create a real-time, or rather let's create a view application that displays the current time. So as you can see here in this example, what we created is a date, and then we have a null, and then we set interval, right? So we're going to go with that first. So in order to implement that, what we need to do first is we need to declare a data. So we need to declare a data function. So data is a block where you declare all of the variables that you can use in a template. So for example, let's set here date. Once I declared here that you have a date, for example, like this one, or rather, wrong. Since it is a function, we need to first return an object. So in a data function, what you need to do is to always return an object. So in this case, we're going to return, let's say, the date. Let's say for now it is null. So like that. So now we have a null date, right? So while it's still right there, or rather while we declare the date right there, what we're going to do next is to replace, or we're going to add another section here. So let's say the date is, now here's the important part. We add a double curly brackets right here, meaning whatever is inside here is considered as a JavaScript. So in this case, we're going to add the variable name here. As you can see, it auto detects the variable. So when you say date inside the curly brackets, it refers to the date variable right here. So for now, it is set to null, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to display nothing here. So as you can see, the date is blank, right? So since it is blank, what this means is the variable contains nothing. So in order to populate this, we need to add a function that adds a value to it. So let's say we have, let's say, something. If you type let's say, just for testing purposes, let's say a string, in, the date is, let's say, what date is today? So September 4, 2021. So we have a static content, right? So once we do that, the value gets updated here as well. So if I remove the specific value from here and hit save, what's going to happen is it's going to update the values as well. So that's what it means when you say your DOM is reactive, meaning it reacts to the changes of your code or to the changes of your variables. So in order to demonstrate its reactivity, we're going to add a function that increments the current date in order to create the illusion that we have a date up and running. So in order to do that, we simply need to create a set interval function. So let's grab this one. So now that we have copied the function, we need to add a mounted. So you might ask, what is mounted? So mounted is a hook, meaning when we say hook, it is part of the Vue life cycle, which we will be tackling later on. We will be showing you what the Vue life cycle does. So in basic layman's terms, the mounted is the part when, or rather where, the DOM is already loaded, meaning the data or the HTML itself is now ready to display content. Or rather, the data is already displayed. Once that function or once that state is reached in a VueJs app, if you have declared a mounted function in your VueJs component, whatever is inside of it gets run through as well. So in this case, let's add a function that creates a set interval, which is basically displaying the current date every 1 second. So you have a set interval here, and then you have a function that populates this date, meaning we're pointing to this variable right here, and then we're assigning this value. So we created a date object, and then we format it to the local string. So this function will run once every second. So once we do that, what's going to happen is, let's just put this back to null for now. Once we do that, what's going to happen is you're going to have this. So as you can see, I am doing nothing currently, like my hands are up here, but the DOM is updating constantly. So since we added a function that computes the current date every single second, you get the illusion that we have a clock running in our DOM. So that is what it means when you have a reactive component. That is one of the most powerful features of VueJs. It allows you to bind reactive content to your HTML. So one use case of reactivity is, imagine you have a, let's say, what do we call this? You have a text that you want to change values over time. Now, instead of doing that manually by clicking something or triggering an event, you have a data that is bound to the DOM directly. So you have this one. So as you can see, we're not changing anymore any content, but it still keeps updating itself, right? Since the date variable is bound to the DOM, which is in this case here, here's the data, right? So we have the date variable here, and then we declared it as an element to the HTML at the top in the template, right? So since we have already bound the data as well as the template, they are now connected based on the date variable. we now can manipulate the contents of that variable. So in this case, we added a set interval. So what the set interval does is it changes the value of date once every second. So whatever the current value here is, it gets transferred to the date variable, and then it updates itself once every second. So imagine that you started with null, right? So it is blank. So it gets rendered blank initially. Then once this function runs, the value of null gets overridden with this value, and it constantly gets overridden every second. So that is what is going on in this example, demonstration here. The date value is constantly updating every single second and changes value based on the function itself. So that is what it means when you have a reactive VueJs app. So in the handout, you will also notice the input binding. So when you say input binding, imagine you have a form. So you have a form, right? So you have a text box there, or a input type text in a sense. And then you have a submit button. So in terms of input binding, we can bind data directly to the HTML's values themselves. So in order to do that, we simply need to add an input element. So let's add an input type, let's say text, and then in order to bind this one, you need to add a vModel like that. So for now, we have an empty vModel, right? So next, we need to add the, let's say, input text. So let's declare this value. So now we have an input text right here. And then we add the vModel right here. So what we did was we bound the data directly to the form itself, which is in the form of input. So in order to display as well what it can do, we can add another div here. Let's say h6 u type. Then let's bind the input text here. So let's add the input text. So once you hit save, if we go back to our application, you can see this one here, right? So if I type something here, guess what happens? That is what you call input binding. Whatever your content is, or rather whatever the content of your form is, or your input is, it gets bound to the variables themselves. So if you declare that variable, or if you use it in a different part of your component, it gets updated as well. So now you have two elements combined together. So if I remove this one as well, it gets updated also. So they are reactive, meaning they are connected together. Whatever the value I set here gets set as well to the value below, meaning they are connected with a single data variable. So that's what it means when you have an input binding. So let's say hello there. So it gets updated in real time as well. So whatever the content here is, that will be the content of the other variable as well, if you declare it in a template. So here I am. So like that. So that is one example of input binding. So it doesn't just apply to inputs themselves. You can also use them in select. You can use them in, let's say, radio buttons, checkboxes. So you can use them in any part of a form. So aside from input binding, you also have class binding. So what is class binding? Class binding basically is a way of binding classes to your elements based on a certain conditions. So in this example, let's try to manipulate the input that you just created. So let's say you want to validate if this has content, right? So first what we're going to do is we're going to declare classes. So let's say, let's use this classes right here. So first we need to declare these styles right here. So as you can see, what we did is we created two styles, right? We have the green border, which signifies that all is well and all is good. And then we have a red border, which means that something is wrong. So now that we have declared that styles, what we need to do next is to bind that to our input template, or in our input HTML value in the template. So you can see here that we have a class, right? So we grab this one and then we paste it here. So I will be explaining to you how this works. You can see that we have the class right here, right? And it has a column here as well. So the column here indicates that we are binding variables to our property. As you can see, we have the name, right? And then we have the exclamation point name. So let's replace this with our values here, like so. Meaning, okay, let's rearrange this for maximum readability. There we go. So, going back. In order to make a graph, what this does, here is the class themselves, right? So we declared the classes green border as well as the red border. So what we need to do if you have something like this is first you need to add a column to declare that it is a data binding, and then we're going to add an object inside of it indicated by the curly brackets here. So let's add a space here instead in order to make it more visible. So now you can see that they are an object rather. So it is an object. Next, we're going to feed the object with key value pairs. So in order to do that, you need to declare the key as the class name itself. So in this case, we have a green border, right? So we use green border as the class name right here. And then the other value, or the value of that key, must suffice either true or false. Meaning, if the variable here satisfies as true, this class, which is the green border, appears. But if it is false, the class, or rather, if this input text is false, the class here is not added to the element. So what do you mean by that? So in order to show you what it does in real life, so you can see here that our input element currently has a red border. Now why is that? That is because we declared the specific condition that if the input text is nothing or contains nothing, which is indicated by the exclamation point, or in other terms, a falsy statement, it will display the red border. But if the input text returns a truthy value, meaning it contains something, it will display the green border. So if we go back here, if you type a word something, you will notice that the border color changed to green, right? So in order to emphasize, we can apply this same class binding to our element here, like that. So like this one. No, let's move this back. So like that. And then you'll see like that. Oh, wrong. So instead of using the border, let's say red text. So let's add another class here. So let's say text color, or rather color, red. And then let's add a green text. And then let's set it to color green. Now we have two classes, right? So we simply need to grab this class and then we paste it right here. And then for the red one, we grab this one, and then we paste it here. Right? So once we do that, you have a red text, right? Because it contains nothing. But if we type something here, the text turns green as well as the border turns green. So that is one example of input binding, or rather class binding. So you can bind classes to your elements based on certain conditions. So you can change classes on the fly. So you can change classes on the fly using code conditions. So in this case, let's see. So in this case, what we did was we bound the conditions based on the value of the input, right? So let's say if the input value contains a text named hello, or any text for that matter, the border turns green. So you have here a green border, and then the text as well turns green because that is what we indicated in our conditions, right? So if we go back to the code, we bound the green border as well as the green text to the element. So that's what we did. Next, if we have a falsy value here, we remove this one, it turns red because what we declared in the code is if the input text contains nothing, or it has a falsy value, the red border appears as well as the red text. So as you will notice, it just switches classes on the fly. So that is what it means by that. So that is an example of a class binding. Next, we have element visibility based on the input binding. So let's say you have to explain further, element visibility, right? So you can hide or show elements based on input bindings. So let's say you want to display this, let's say this element right here, you want to display it only if the user has inputted something. But if he does not input anything, we will not display this yet. So in order to demonstrate, we can remove the class for now since we can do that. So in order to do that, we simply need to add a vShow property. And then the condition for displaying it is if input text is true. Meaning, if there's nothing here, it doesn't display. And as soon as I type something or I content here, it appears. Hello, let's say. So, as you can see, like that. So, okay, so what it means is that if the input value here, or rather the text box, contains nothing, like this one, it won't display anything at all. But if we add, let's say, let's add a text, let's say text, like this one, you will see that the HTML gets displayed as well. But as soon as we remove this, the element hides again. So that is what you mean, or that is what is meant when you say element visibility based on input binding. So you can display elements based on the input bindings themselves. So that is another feature of VueJs. So event handling. So in this case, what are events? So events are stuff that triggers or that gets triggered when you do certain actions. for example, a click or something like that, right? So let's use the most basic, what do you call this? Let's use the most basic event instead, the click. So in order to demonstrate what VueJs can do when it comes to events, we can use the button, right? So let's create a button here. So button at click, well, let's say show alert, like that. And then let's add an HTML content here. Next, we're going to create methods. Now you might ask, what are methods? Methods are a section of a VueJs component that allows you to declare functions that can be used in the template blocks here. So if you say show alert here, if you say at click, rather if you use at click, which is right here, you simply click what happens is, if you click the at click, or what do you call this? If this event gets triggered, which is a click, meaning if you click the button, this method gets triggered. So right now we don't have a show alert method yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to create that. So as you can see, we have a show alert function here, right? So like this one. Next is, what we're going to do is, let's say alert. Hello. So what happens is, if we click this button, there should be an alert, right? So there's not yet. Anyway, so so let's try refreshing it for now. There you go. So if you click the button, so what we let me run through what just happened earlier. So we have a button, right? So this button is that. So if you click this button, what happens is this one gets triggered. So the click event gets fired. Now when it gets fired, it's going to ask for a method, which is the show alert that we declared here. So if you click the button, it fires the show alert method, which is below here. Now once the function is fired, what the function does is it shows an alert. So it displays the alert. It displays an alert modal at the top and then shows a string which is hello. So that is what happened earlier. So if we try it again, if I click this button, the hello appears. So that means VueJs can handle events as well. So it can handle native events. It can also handle VueJs events. So we also have a conditional rendering. So you might ask, what is a conditional rendering? Conditional rendering is a fancy term used for displaying HTML contents based on certain conditions. So this one is an example of a conditional rendering. So if you take a look at the example here, so we have a click me, right? So let's add another button. Let's say, okay, so let's just close this one instead. Okay, and then let's add this button here. Okay, so now we have two divs, right? So that, and then let's add a click event again. So and then let's just leave it empty for now. Toggle, let's say toggle element, and then let's say click me too. So now we have two buttons, right? So if you take a look, oh, so it's an error, still an error, okay? Oh, okay, so I get it. So let's add a parent element here. There we go. So So let's rearrange this. So right, so now we have two buttons, right? So if we click the second button, which is this one, the toggle element method is going to get triggered. So since we don't have that yet, let's declare that first. Toggle element. So let's say like that. Now what's it going to do is it's going to flip the value of the data component. So in the data, let's declare a, let's say, show element. For now, let's set it to false. Meaning the value of this is a false one, right? So what we're going to do in the toggle element is to simply flip that value over. So this, the show element, is equals to the opposite of the element. So show element. So that. So what we just did is, every time the function gets triggered, the opposite value of the variable here is stored to the component. So if this one is true, it becomes false. And then if this one is false, it becomes true. So now that we have that, we simply grab this one, and then let's add a, let's say, what do we call this? Let's add another div here. Let's say this one. Hello. Hello there. Something like that. So now that we have a basic div, what we're going to use is an if statement. So let's just paste this here. So what did we just do? So what we did is we created a button that whenever it gets when you click that button, the toggle element function fires, right? So this that show element gets flipped. So if it is false, it becomes true, and vice versa. Now once we click the button, the value here changes, and then the value here also changes. So what it does is, if you click this button, so let's refresh first. The element appears, and then if I click this again, it disappears, right? So that is what you call conditional rendering. So conditional rendering is a function of, or a part of VueJs that allows you to render content based on certain conditions. So in a sense, it is similar to class bindings. So if the show element value here is true, then the entire component or the entire HTML block here gets rendered. But if it is false, it gets de-rendered. So you may ask, or you may notice as well, that the vShow and the vIf is kind of the same, right? So in reality, they are not the same at all. So in the what do you call this? In the VueJs handouts, you will notice that it has a clause here regarding vIf versus vShow and what to use between the two. So you can just take a look at it, and then you will see the difference between the two. So later on, we will be talking about them as well. So for now, let's leave it at that. Next, we have list rendering. So one common HTML property that we use is we render lists, right? So if we render a list, we need a list, right? So what do you call this? Yes, so as you can see in the example, we have a list of objects right here. So we have 3 objects, and then it is an array of objects. So to demonstrate list rendering, or rather to demonstrate what it means to render this list right here, we can head over to our code here. So let's create a div, and then what we can do is, let's see, let's add a, what do you call this? So let's deal with the template later. Let's start with the data first. So let's say we have tasks. So we have an array named tasks, right? What we're going to do is we're going to add objects to it. So let's say, what do you call this? Okay, so text. Let's say code. And then another text. Let's say develop. Or rather test. Or wrong. Let's say build. And then we have another object. Let's say text. And then let's set it to deploy. So now we have 3 objects, right? So with these 3 objects, we can now create our own list. So we can render this as a list. So to give you an example or to demonstrate, we simply need to create an unordered list, the UL, right? So we have the UL. So now we have an unordered list, right? Next, we're going to list an item, which is the LI. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a v-for. So what does v-for mean? v-for is a view directive for looping arrays as well as for creating loops. So if you create a v-for, you need to specify what to loop. So in this case, we're going to loop the tasks. So what we're going to add here is we have a task in the array of tasks. So meaning, for every object in the task, it is declared as a task variable here. Next, we're going to add a key. Now, key is a unique identifier in your object that tells you what the object is. So, in database layman's terms, it is the ID. So, it is the unique identifier. It is the primary key. So, in VueJs, the key must have a unique value in order for VueJs to track what content is moving and what is removed. So in this case, we're going to use the task text, meaning the key will be the value itself here as text. Since we can all concur that the text value is unique, right? So they are all unique. So you have code, you have build and deploy. Next, we're going to declare a object, or we're going to do declarative rendering inside the li. So let's set the task.text. So there you go. Once we go back to our application, you will notice that VueJs has rendered our list, meaning with only a short code like this one, we can render as many items as we want. So let's add another. So let's say evaluate. Once I hit save, the value gets added here as well, as you can see right here. So now we have 4 items. But if I remove this one as well, we will go back to 3 items, right? So that is what you call list rendering. So VueJs can list items and then render them accordingly. So for the view component lifecycle, we can head over to the link right here if in case the image is a bit small. So let's try and head over to there. I think the image is kind of small, so we can open this in a new tab. So there you go. So here you have the view image lifecycle. So what we can for the view image lifecycle, the init is the start of the application. It is where the events and the view lifecycle gets initialized. So in order to jump to that part of the initialization, you can use a before create hook. So as you can see, we have the before create. So if you use a before create hook, whatever content is inside there gets fired as soon as the events and lifecycle is initialized for every component or for that component. Next, what it's going to do is it's going to initialize injections and reactivity. Once it is injected, you now have a created. That means that at this point in time, during the created, let's say hook, in that point in time, the component itself is already created. But there's a difference. you see below that it has a template or it has a condition. So it asks if it has a template. If it has a template, the template gets compiled. If it doesn't have one, it compiles as a template. But if in case it has a template option, it gets rendered as a function. So after it does that process, you can inject in a before map. Meaning, this hook is the part where the application or the component itself is not yet mounted to the DOM or not yet included. In a sense, it is only created yet, so it is not yet plugged into the DOM itself. So the next process would be to create the element and then to add that created object or that created component into the element itself. So once it does that, the mounted hook gets triggered. So now you have mounted. So at this point in time, your component is already visible. So you can already see your component. So as you can see here, you now have mounted. Meaning, the application itself is now mounted. So you can now see it in the code itself. So you can now what do you call this? The elements themselves are now visible on your screen. So that is the part of mounted. So in case that you have a date change, meaning the value of the data around here, which is, or any value here for that matter, in case any value out there gets updated or gets changed, updated gets fired. So it is another hook as well. So if you have an updated hook, you can fire that, or the hook itself gets fired. Once it is done, the virtual DOM is re-rendered and then gets patched. Or rather, it's the other way around. So when data change, the before update gets fired. And then the virtual DOM is re-rendered and gets patched. After that, the updated hook gets fired in case you want to do something after the data is updated. But in the case of you want to do something first before updating the data, you can use the before update hook. Now, once the unmount is called, meaning you want to change component, let's say, or you want to hide the component or to destroy it, the before unmount gets called. Meaning, before the element is unmounted, this hook gets fired first. And then once it is unmounted already, meaning it is removed from the DOM, the unmounted hook gets fired. So that is the basic view, or that is the VueJs life cycle. So from the top, first you initialize the events and the life cycle itself, and then the before create gets fired. Next, the injections and reactivity gets initialized. After it does that, the created hook gets fired. And then it asks if it has a template option. It's either a yes or a no. Regardless of the choices, or regardless of the values, or regardless of the response of these two, the before mount gets called. Once it is called, the update element the element itself gets created and then appended to it. So you have the component, and then you have the element, and then they get bound together. So now the mounted hook gets called. So at this point in time, the DOM is already updated, right? So you can see already the component at this point in time. So whenever data changes while it is mounted, the before update hook gets called if it is there as well. And then once it finishes, the virtual DOM gets re-rendered and then gets patched. Meaning the values change and then the DOM gets re-rendered based on the value of the change of data. And then once it does that, the updated hook gets fired as well. So it just repeats that process until such time that the component is already unmounted, meaning we're going to destroy the component. So before it does that, what it does first is it calls the before unmount, hook. So it runs its functions as well. And then lastly, the component itself is now unmounted, meaning it is gone. So at this point in time, the last function to be called is the unmounted hook, meaning at that point or at this point in the life cycle, the DOM is or the component is already gone in the DOM, as well as it is not visible anymore. So that is the VueJs life cycle. So as you can see, you have hooks here as well, right? So if you take a look at the training handouts, you will notice that we have hooks right here. So you also have comments as well here to guide you in using the hooks. So in our code, we use the mounted hook, meaning if we go back to the life cycle, it is around here. So at this point in time, if the component reaches this point in the life cycle, our function here gets called. So it is what we call this? It is run through once. So then that's the point in time that when the function finishes running that, or the mounted hook is finished, the DOM is already mounted. So it is now displayed. So if you take a look at the script here, we have comments to help you understand as well what happens in a Vue lifecycle. So the before create is called after the instance has been initialized, as you can see in the lifecycle. Also, you have the created hook. So the created hook is called after the instance is created. You also have a before mount, which is called right before the mounting begins, meaning before the element gets added to the DOM itself. Now, mounted is called after the instance has been mounted to the DOM itself. And the next, you have updated. So updated is called after a data change caused by the virtual DOM, right, or the data change causes the virtual DOM to be re-rendered and patched. Meaning, if there are changes to the data, the updated hook gets called. And then before unmount is called right before a component instance is unmounted, meaning removed. And then lastly, the unmounted is called after the component has been removed already. So that is the Vue lifecycle hooks. So based on your needs, you can customize them or you can update them based on your code instances as well as needs. So in case you, for example, you want to run a certain function before any display or before any data is displayed, right? So in those cases, you can use the mounted hook to run your functions and your code before anything else happens with the DOM. So in case you want to run something every time the data is, let's say, changed, you use the updated hook to fire a function which runs whenever stuff gets updated or when data gets updated. And then if you, in case you want to run something or in case you want to run a function, once the component itself is destroyed, you use the unmounted hook for that. So aside from the hooks themselves, you also have computed properties and methods. So what are those? So there is a key difference between computed properties and methods. So as you can see here, we have a short, what do you call this? We have provided you a short definition as to the two items. So computed properties are values which are cached based on their reactive dependencies. Meaning, it only reevaluates, or rather it only changes its values when some of its reactive dependencies have changed. So what does that mean? Let's say you have a list, like we have a list of 5 objects. So imagine you have an array of 5 objects. Let's say the example, or let's say this example. So you have all these 3, right? In a computed property, what happens is if the data somewhere along the way changes, the property gets recomputed again. But with computed properties, if there are no changes to the actual array itself, meaning this one, the data here is still the same, it is cached. Meaning, there's no computation involved with that one. Meaning, it only changes it only re-renders if the value has changed. Since the values did not change, it is not going to recompute it whenever the DOM refreshes. So, one example of this is, let's say you have an array of 10 objects, right? Imagine an array of 10 objects. And then, you added, let's say, you changed the value for the other data. So you have another data variable somewhere along your component. And then that value changed. So what happens is, if that value changes, VueJs reevaluates all of your data variables and then renders them to the DOM accordingly. So if it detects that your computed property has not changed at all, it will not recompute itself anymore, therefore saving you CPU time. Meaning, since it is cached, it only computes once, and for every DOM refresh, if the contents are not changing at all, the value or the DOM itself retains the same values without recomputing. So, in a small instance, it may not matter that much. But imagine if you have an array which contains, let's say, 1,000,000 objects inside of it. Now, every time, what happens is, if that array is not a computed property, every time the DOM changes, the entire array gets re-evaluated. So that is CPU costly, and it's very in a sense, it is very costly in terms of CPU power, because every time the DOM changes, the VueJs has to run the entire array of millions of objects and then displace them accordingly. Meanwhile, if that array is a computed property, the VueJs only needs to compute those array once, and then if there are no changes to that array, it never recomputes it again. It simply reuses the one which was computed previously. So that way you save a lot of computing power, and then you save as well DOM reactivity. So to cut the story short, as you can see here, we have a TLDR. You need to use computed properties when functionality reacts to DOM changes, meaning there are frequent changes to the DOM itself. But you need to use methods when functionality is triggered by a user event. So as you can see here, so we have methods, right? Methods are, in other terms, methods which are this one below here. Although the computed and methods are completely the same, the difference is that methods has no caching at all. Meaning, if you bind a method to the DOM, whenever the DOM changes, it runs the function whenever a re-render happens, which is CPU intensive. Meanwhile, computed properties only runs its function whenever it detects that the data has changed. But if it has not changed upon DOM refresh, it will not recompute those values again. So imagine you have a millions again of array of objects. So for the computed properties, what happens is it evaluates the millions once. But for the methods, whenever the DOM update, or whenever there is a DOM update, the method itself gets called, meaning you need to run through all of those millions of objects every time the DOM changes. So that is very CPU costly. So that's why we recommend that you use computed properties when functionality reacts to DOM changes. Meaning you have a certain function that is dependent on the DOM changes. meaning it is based on the UI state. Meanwhile, you use methods when the functionality is triggered by a user event. For example, a click. For example, you have different types of events. So the click is the most common. So that means if you have a click function or a function that runs whenever you click something, you declare that as a method. But if you have a functionality that needs to compute every time the DOM changes, you need to use computed properties in order to save CPU processing capabilities. So as you can see here in this example, we have a list. We have a rendering of a list, right? So we rendered a list here. And then you will notice that we have a computed object here. And then we have a function which is things to do. So if you read the comment, it says that this statement's result is cached and will only reevaluate, meaning it will only run this function whenever the sample list, which is this list, changes content. Otherwise, if it retains its values, it will never run through this function again every time the code or the DOM changes. So it only runs through once. But if a change is detected, obviously it's going to run the function again. Meanwhile, if you declare it as a method, that is not the case. So every time the DOM changes, this function gets triggered again and again and again and again every time the DOM changes. So that is one key difference between the two. That's why we use computed properties to save computational power, and then we use methods when we use them for user-dependent events. So next, here is what this one is what we discussed earlier, the VIF versus VShow argument. So as you may notice in our code here, we have a VIF, right? So we have a VIF as well as a VShow. So they are fundamentally the same. They have the same, fundamentally they are the same in terms of principle. But functional wise, they are different at all. So if you go into this example, VIF is a real conditional rendering. What do we mean by real? Real means, in a sense, that if you use a VIF, that component gets rendered real or gets rendered in real time, and at the same time, everything gets initialized and deinitialized every VIF instance. So if you take a look here, events, listeners, and child components are properly destroyed and recreated, meaning it is costly to use VIF compared to VShow, because every time you use a VIF, let's say you bound an element and then let's say VIF, right? So you click a button, let's say a button, and then the VIF is based on the click event, which is what we did earlier, right? So what happens is, if the component satisfies as true, it will get rendered, meaning it will create event listeners for that component, and then it will render the child components as well. So that means it is in a sense a lazy loading. So you only load the component once the event itself has been fired or the condition to satisfy, or the condition satisfies as true. So as you can see here, DOM elements are properly destroyed and recreated. So in other terms, it is lazy. So in essence, DOM elements, which are the HTML themselves, will not render unless condition is true on first load. So that is the key difference. So imagine you have a VIF component, and then it is set to false, right? If it is set to false, once the DOM initializes and gets displayed, So imagine you have a DOM which is displayed now, and then you have a component which is based on a VIF. That component will not render as long as its value is false. So that is the difference. But if it is set to true, then that is the only time the component gets rendered into the DOM. So that is what it means by lazy. So you only load the component once the condition satisfies as true. So upon first load, it will not display that component at all, nor will it render it to the DOM. Whereas the VShow is a different case. A component declared with a VShow is always rendered regardless of condition. Meaning, if you declare a component as a VShow, upon first load, meaning the first initialization of the component, that component is rendered as well. But the key difference is it uses CSS to toggle the elements on and off. Meaning it uses the CSS capabilities, which is visibility, to show and hide elements. So in essence, event listeners and child components stay rendered regardless of condition. So on first load, if you have event listeners for that component and you have child components, they get rendered as well. So they stayed there until the parent component is destroyed. So DOM elements stay rendered when toggling the visibility on and off. So that is the key difference for VShow and VIF. So to recap, VIF properly creates and destroys your components, including its event listeners. So in a sense, it is lazy loading. Whereas VShow is always rendered regardless of condition, including its event listeners and child components. So the only way to turn them on and off is using CSS visibilities. So to make the long story short, we use VShow if you need to toggle something on and off very often. Meaning you need to display and to hide content all the time, or most of the time, or in weird cases all the time. But if that is not the case, use VIF instead. Meaning, you use VIF if the component is not supposed to appear and disappear that much. So let's say it only appears based on a user event. So we're not sure if that's going to display immediately or not. So that is one of the cases where you can set the VShow versus VIF. So that is the difference. So next we have components. So components is a different part of VueJs. So in the previous topics, what we discussed is the basic functionalities of VueJs. Now this time we're going to talk about components. So when do you use components? We use components if there are repeated functionalities across multiple pages, and it is used to decouple long mangled spaghetti code bases. So what do you mean by that? Imagine if all of your functionality and all of your code is located in a single view file. That is what is meant by this long mangled spaghetti code base. So you have in a sense, a very long, a very complicated single view file. So instead of settling for one view file, we can use components for that. So imagine you have let's go back to the website example. Imagine that you have an HTML which has a header, body, as well as a footer. So you have 3 sections, right? There are 2 ways to go about it. Either you put all of those HTML content in a single view file, or you split them into 3 components, namely the header component, the body component, as well as the footer component, and then you render them to a single central component, meaning the body itself or the HTML itself. So that is what it's meant when you use components. So components allows us to separate our codes into more logical sections which can be repeatedly used in different pages. For example, one example of a component is, let's say, a modal component or a pop-up or a form, so something like that. So since we use components, it has its own data variables as well, right? So you will ask, how do we pass data to and from components? So in order to pass data from parent component to child component, we use props. Whereas to pass data from the child component back to the parent component, we use emit. So that is the key difference between components. So in order to demonstrate how to use components, we can have a simple component right here. So let's say this is our component, right? So we have the, let's say this. So this index.view is basically a component. So that is one example. So to emphasize, we can create a parent component. So let's say this is our parent component, which is the index, right? So we have a parent component named index. So let's say you want to create another component. Let's say, to emphasize, let's set a child index component. So like that. Meaning we have a component as a child. So let's say, based on the example, we simply add the textual content. So let's say, let's use this one. So like that. So now, as you can see, we have a child component right here, right? So in order to use this component back to our parent, which is the index, what we're going to do is we're going to import that component by simply typing import and then the file name itself. And then, now that we have imported it, we set the path, which is the same directory here. So we simply add the period slash the file name. So that is how you import the component. Next, we declare here a components. So it is an object, meaning it declare, in this part, we declare what components gets re-rendered alongside with the index. So we simply copy this file name we created here, which is this one, and then we add it here, meaning we have registered this file as a component of the index file. Now lastly, how do we display it as a component? You simply add a div here, or any element for that matter, and then you paste the component name itself as an HTML element. So once you do that, what you're going to see here is our child component is rendered alongside our parent component. So our parent component is this one, right? So you can imagine that this part is the parent. And then you have here the child component. So we discussed earlier about passing data. So how do we pass data from the parent to the child? We use props for that. So in order to use props, what we need to do is like this one. So now that we have our, now that we have our parent-child component bound together, we now ask, how do we pass data to and from components, right? So there's only two ways it can go about. Either parent to child, meaning from index to child index, or from child to parent, which is child index back to index. So there's only two ways it can go about. It cannot pass data from components which are way above the top of the tree. So imagine you have a DOM tree, so you have a hierarchy of components. It can only pass to and from its parent as well as its child. It cannot pass two levels above that. So that is the limitations of components. So in order to pass data to the child component, we add props. So in order to use props, you simply need to use a, let's say, this one. So let's say, what do you call this? Value. Hello. So something like that. So we have a string, right? Child prop. Let's say message instead. So let's set hello there. So now you have a message, right? Next, we have our child index component here, right? What we're going to do is we're going to set it right here. So let's say message. And then we pass the message variable here. Now, you will notice that we have a colon right here, right? What this colon means is that we are declaring a property to the component, which is props. So in order to catch the value of this, or rather what it means is that we are passing the message, which is the data here, to the component child index in the name message, in the form of message. So to the child component, how do we catch that? So in order to catch that, you simply need to add a props right here. So props is an array of names of properties that gets passed from the parent. So in this case, we used message, right? So we simply need to copy this and then we paste this here. Now that it's passed here, you can now bind it to your child component. Let's say message. So once we do that, here is our message, which is the hello there, right? So that is how you pass data from parent to the child. So if you take a look, we did not declare any data variables in our child, but rather we simply passed a value from the parent, which is this message. Hi there. Your message. Let's say I am from parent. Something like that. So we declared this value, right? So it's a string. What happens is this string data from the message itself gets passed here as a parameter and then gets transferred to this property for the child index. Next, in order for the child property to catch that passed variable, what we did is we added props, which is the message itself, right? And then, now that we have the message as a prop, we can use it as a data, as a replacement to the data. So you can bind that to the DOM like this one. So if we go back, you can see that our modified string is rendered as well in a child component. So you might ask now this time, or rather, in this case you may ask, how do we go back from child to the parent, right? So we can also do that. We can pass data from the child component back to the parent component. So in order to do that, we will use what is called emit. So as you can see here in our example, we can pass a data from the child component back to the parent using emit. So in order to do that, we need to create something that triggers for something that is in a sense a trigger to send data back to the parent. So in this case, let's use the button. Let's say button and click emit to parent, send to parent. So something like that. And then let's rename it as send love back, send love, or something like that. So now we have a button component, right? Or rather, we have a button inside the component. Next, what we're going to do is, since we created a click event or we bound a click event, it's going to ask for a method. So let's create that method. which is namely the send to parent. This one, right? So like this. Now we have a function. So at this point in time, we will send, or rather what we want to do is, if we click the button, we send a data back to the parent. So, or rather, how will that happen? What we're going to do is, we need to type this $emit. Meaning, we're going to emit a certain event that the parent will need to catch. So, in this case, we need to add the pass message. Let's say, pass message. And then, it should be single quotations, like that. And then we're going to pass a value. Let's say, I am from child. So something like this. Now that we have that, what we did, or rather what we did basically is, we created an event from the child. So what happens is, if you click the button, the send to parent method gets called, and then the child component emits an event. So what event is that? The event that we declared is pass message. Now, there's an error. So let's wrap this into a single element like that. So we emitted a pass message, right? So how will the parent catch that? By adding an event handler, which is at, and then you type the pass dash message. Why is it, you may ask, why is it like that? So the syntax for emitting events is a Pascal case, or rather a camel case, meaning the first letter is small, and then the subsequent letters gets capitalized like this one. So that is camel case. And then, once we head to the parent component, the syntax would be like this one. So it's snake case. So you have the small p, and then the capital M gets removed, and then instead replaced with a dash, and then a smaller version of that. So you have a pass message which is camel case here, and then for the parent, you have a snake case pass message like this one. And then now that we have handled the event itself, we need to add a method for parsing that. So let's say parse child message. So now we have declared a method. So we're going to create that method right here. Now notice the key difference here. This function here has a parameter, which is the message. So you will ask, where did message come from? This parameter here came from here. Okay? Again, to repeat, the message parameter here is this one. So let's go back again. So we started with a click, right? So we have a click event, and then we have a method which will fire when we click the button. And then the function creates an emit, meaning it emits an event that the parent will catch. So the name of the event is pass message, and then the arguments we pass to that event is a string. Now going to the parent component, we catch that event using a snake case like this one, right? So we catch the event. So again, the child emitted an event, meaning it passed an event back to the parent, and then the parent catches that event and then redirects it or handles that event using this function right here, which is the parse child message. Now this parse child message is a method of the parent component, which is down here. And then we pass we have a parameters for that function, which is the message. Now this message parameter here comes from the emit parameter we declared here. So that is what the message means. So if we remove this, we won't be able to access these parameters here or the value here. But if we declare it here, or any name for any matter, what this parameter contains is the contents that you passed in the emit. So it can be an object, it can be an array, or it can be any type of data you want. So any data you declare here is set as a parameter for your method in the parent. So to demonstrate, we can simply alert the passed message, like so. So what happens is we have a button here, right? So let's refresh this for now. Okay, so it's not triggering. Wait. So, okay, parse child message. Okay, so send parent. Let's see. So it's not triggering. Okay, let's see. Okay. Parse child message. Pass message. So send that. Pass message. Okay, so let's try that. So okay, I get it. So okay, so the name you pass in the event, which is this one, must be the same. I apologize for that. So the event you set here must be exactly the same with the parent here. So you in order to avoid further future conflicts, you simply copy your value here and then you paste it here and then add this syntax to indicate an event. So as you can see, if I click the send log, there is the value, and do note that this value is from the child component, not the parent component, okay? So we can try to go, to reiterate, we first created a button with a click event which is handled by the send to parent method, which is this one. And then once we do that, the function emits an event which is named pass message, and then we pass a value to that event in the form of a string, which is this one, and then that event gets passed to the parent, right? So back to the parent component, we handle that event using the same event that was declared in the child. So as you can see, they are exactly the same. The only difference is we use an event handler here, which is the at command, which is this which is this one right here. And then in order to handle that event in the parent component, we set a method which is named parse child message. So that method is this one below. And also you will notice that our method has a parameter which is message. Now this message parameter contains the values here, meaning whatever content you put in the emit variable or whatever argument you pass to the emit gets transferred to your parent here in the form of this variable. And lastly, we simply displayed that variable using, or we displayed the content of that variable, which is a string, using the alert command. So if you click the send log, you can see that we have a string which is an output from the child component. So that is an example of how components talk to each other and transfer data to and from components. So that is the basics of VueJs. So to recap, we discussed what VueJs is. We tackled the reasons why we should use VueJS, we also what do you call this? We also demonstrated its capabilities, and lastly, we created our own component, or we demonstrated the components as well as how we can transfer data to and from components. Now, okay. So, yes. So now that we have that up and running, it's time for your VueJS activity to get your hands on, or to get your hands, what do you call this? To have something to get your hands on and to try to experiment as well. So, for your VueJS activity, which is activity 2, you will be familiarizing yourself with VueJS. So, you will learn how to create your own VueJS app as well as host it in a development server. So, for this activity, you will need to create a simple to-do list. So, what is a to-do list? The to-do list is basically a, what do you call this? It is a, what do you call this? Okay, so a to-do list is a simple application that allows you to add items to the list using an input form and then remove items from the list using an X button. So that is what a to-do list, or that is a simple to-do list. So you will be using the same repository in the previous activity, which is the training repository that we provided. So if you want to, in case you don't, in case you need to find the link for the repository, you can find it below in the pinned comment section. So before proceeding with the activity, you must first install Node.js, which is what we did earlier and at the beginning of the session, right? So we set up our Node.js as well as our Vue CLI. So for part 1, you have the specific instructions here. So you simply need to follow them along. So first you need to install the CLI, and then you navigate to the directory of the repository, and then you open a terminal, and then you create a new branch inside the repository following this format, which is activity2 dash your name, in order for us to track, which activity you are developing. It is also our way of checking on your progresses, because we can see the code base from here. So once you created your own branch, you need to check out to that created branch. And then you create your own Vue project using the command vue create to do. So you simply choose the default when the option prompt appears. Again, to re-emphasize, you need to choose the default, which is the Vue 2. So we will be using Vue 2 for this activity. Now, once the installation finishes, simply type npm run then serve. So at that point, your VueJS or your VueJS application is now ready for development. So for the part 2, which is the creating the to-do app itself, you need to implement the following behaviors. First, the user types a to-do item on an input box. Next, so imagine an input box. So you have an input box, right? So you type an item there, and then you simply click an add button, which is beside the input. So you need to click that button in order to add items to the current list. Next, once you do that, the item itself is appended to the to-do list. Now, so if, imagine this specific behavior. So if you type something on the input box and then you click the add button, whatever you type on the input box is added as a to-do list below. So you can remove items, or rather, once the items is added to your to-do list, you can remove individual items by simply clicking the X button. So there's an X button for every item that you add in your to-do list. So that is the behavior for the VueJS to-do list app. So again, you have an input box, and then you have to type an item to that, and then if you click the button, that item gets added to your list, which is a list of items below the input, and then you can remove items from the list by clicking the X button beside every item. So this to-do app caters, or rather this to-do app covers the input binding. You also have event handling, and then you have list rendering. So this is a culmination of all the features that we have discussed earlier. So if you, in case you have difficulties, you can notify us and we can assist you regarding the activity itself. But for the part of creating the to-do app, we can simply guide you with the behavior. So, but in case you have difficulties, we can help you implement those as well. So after your coding session, you can commit your changes, push them to the repository, and then notify us in order for us to check your outputs. So that is the VueJs activity for the basic. So so that is the activity for the basic VueJs. So for the advanced VueJs, we will be tackling that later on this afternoon. So what are we going to tackle in the afternoon session later? So now that we are aware of the basic VueJs capabilities, we can now expand it a little bit further by using plugins, using Vuex, VueRouter, as well as the, yes, so I think that's it. So we can use Vuex and VueRouter as well. So we can also tap on components. So we can tap that along a little bit as well. But since we are quite ahead of time, we introduced components earlier already. So in order to give you a heads up about it. And then next is for the advanced training, we will be also issuing another activity, but it is quite, actually it is still the same with the basic activity. The only key difference is instead of using the data, we use the Vuex itself. So later on we will be showing you that activity. So so that's it for this morning session. So do you guys have any questions? Please don't hesitate to comment down below. So we will answer your questions in case you have inquiries, as well as you need or some help regarding the activities. So also, please don't forget to head over to our Gitlab repository in order to catch up with the activity, as well as to visit the handouts as well. So all of in the handouts, everything is provided already. So you can also check the Gitlab repository. Okay, so you can also use rather you can visit the Gitlab repository in order to pull it to your own. Okay, so you can use the Gitlab repository to pull it into your own environment, and then use it to code as well as to create your VueJs application. So aside from that, you need to set up your VueJs project, and then for those of you who need to have the handouts, you can also, okay, so you also have the handouts for the VueJs training, which is this one, which contains all of the topics which will be covered in the basic and the advanced. So it's a single file for all the features that we will be discussing in the afternoon session. So that's it for this morning session, and thank you guys for watching. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop by down the comment section, and we will be assisting you regarding that. So in case you have inquiries, please don't hesitate to comment down below. So okay. Yes. So wait. Okay, so let's also, please don't forget to share the Pixel8 Academy's basic software training program in order to let others know as well regarding this training, in order for us to teach more of you guys regarding VueJs as well as Gitlab and Git, and then lastly Quasar. So for the next week, we will be tackling Quasar itself. So for this afternoon, we will be tackling the VueX as well as the Vue router. So please do stay tuned for the afternoon session. Okay, so let's see. Okay, let's see. So okay. So again, wait. Okay. So let's see. Let's try opening this one with PLC. Okay. So it's not displaying properly. Okay. So let's see. We can set it up later again. So oh no, it's having technical difficulties. So anyway, so okay, so okay, so I think that's it. Are there any questions? So far, there's none yet. Okay, so let's simply, okay. Oh, so somebody asked, what is the difference between mounted and before mount? So, okay, so for the mounted, the key difference between mounted and before mount is called right before the mounting begins and the render function is about to be called for the first time. So imagine that the before mount gets called before the element or before the component itself is even rendered to the DOM. So imagine that you are, let's say you are initializing the component. So you have a component, right? So we are initializing that. So before mount gets called right before the element even gets rendered. So before rendering the element, it calls first the before mount function and then performs its duties. And then once it finishes that, that is the time that the VueJs renders the component. And then after it gets rendered, that is when mounted gets called. So the key difference between the two is before mount is called before the DOM gets rendered, while the mounted is called after the element gets rendered to the DOM. So there's a key difference between the two. So one key difference is usually in the before mounted, the data variables are still not initialized. So it is uninitialized in the first run through. But in the mounted, they are already initialized. So it is suggested to use the, what do you call this? Use mounted instead of before mount, because mounted already has the data bound to the component itself. So there are also use cases when you want to use before mount. For example, you want to run a function, or you want to check if he is allowed to access the component in the first place. If he is not allowed to access, then you might as well reject him from displaying the component itself. Whereas for the mounted instance, in case you want to modify the, let's say the data, first obviously you need the data to be initialized first, and then that is the time that the component or the data gets modified after the mounted hook gets called. So that is the difference between the two. So there are specific use cases for each, and so there are specific use cases for the both of them. So so there you go. I hope that answers your question. Okay. So let's see, are there any further questions so far? Okay, so there's none. So again guys, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to comment down below. We will be answering your questions as well as your inquiries, so please don't hesitate. So, which part? Okay, so, okay. So let's see. Oh, okay. Okay, I see. Okay. Yes. So for the trainings, again to reiterate, currently we're at the basic software training, right? So aside from the basic software training, we also have intermediate trainings as well as advanced. So the basics covers the introduction of the VueJs, Git, as well as Quasar and its basic usages, while intermediate focuses more on the usage of these three technologies in tandem. So you will be using all of these three technologies together with each other, and then you will be implementing several activities in order to test your knowledge regarding these technologies. So for the advanced, please do stay tuned for that. So the advanced will be covered, or the advanced will be discussed to you once the intermediate is finished. Also, in order to join the intermediate training, you must first pass the basic training, because the intermediate covers the usage of the three technologies. So it is required that you need to pass the basics first in order for you to catch up or to use the technologies stated, or to use the technologies in the intermediate levels. So for the advanced, we will be discussing with you the advanced once you pass the intermediate trainings. So that is how it works. So also, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button in our YouTube channel in order to get notified of our future training sessions like this one, as well as when new tutorial videos gets uploaded, because we upload tutorial videos on a regular basis in our YouTube channel. So if you want to learn more about the technologies that we use, you may subscribe to our channel and you can get notified, as well as you will learn from our tutorial videos. So aside from that, you can also like our page, which is the Pixel8 Academy, in order to get notified whenever we go live as well, because we also go live with these trainings here. So aside from those, we also post content in our Pixel8 Academy. So in case you want to get notified, we will be notifying you here in our page as well. So, okay, so I think, so far there are still no questions. Okay, so again guys, please don't hesitate to comment as well as to leave leave questions down below in order for us to answer your inquiries. So please don't hesitate and just keep commenting down below. So okay. So far they're still okay. So here's the activity. Okay, so far there are no questions. Okay. Okay, so there are still none. Okay, so let's wait for a bit. Maybe there are questions just before we close this session. Again guys, please don't hesitate to spread the news regarding these trainings that we have in order for us to teach you more, or in order for us to reach more people and to teach you guys the technologies that we use as well. So in order for us to help you guys develop your own applications as well using these technologies. So please don't hesitate to spread the word around. So, okay. Let's see. Yes. Oh, okay, so is it a good practice to use VIF and V4 together? So, let's see. VIF is a feature that allows you to display or hide content based on certain conditions, right? So V4 on the other hand is a directive that allows you to loop arrays and array of objects. So it allows you to loop all of those let's say items and then display them accordingly. So to use VIF and V4 in combination is not actually a bad practice per se. So it depends on the implementation. Let's say you want to display a list of items if and only if the user wants to view them. So one way of implementing that would be to create a button which triggers the VIF instance, and then once the VIF instance gets triggered, that is the time that the V4 instance gets rendered. So in a sense, it is not a bad practice. So it depends upon the use case as well as the implementation side. So in that example implementation, what we did, or what the example did, is it only renders the list, which is the V4 list, once the button is clicked. So in terms of performance, that is actually a good thing. Why? Because the element or the list itself only renders itself once the VIF is set as true. So in case you set it as vShow, the list will render on first load and then stays there even though the content is displayed or not. Whereas if you use a VIF, the list itself will only render if and only if you click that button. So in a sense, the lazy load feature is a good practice because you save CPU resources, as well as we are sure that the user may or may not click that button, therefore saving CPU power, meaning the list only renders if the user wants to view those items. If not, then it's not going to display those items. So based on use cases, it is actually a good practice. But there are also use cases where VIF is not advised to combine with V4. instead of using VIF, it is better to use VShow. So one example would be if let's say the component is reactive, or rather is based on user input or something that changes often instead of the typical user input. So if the DOM changes often and the visibility of that component is based off that one, then expect the component to always turn on and turn off. So if you bound that to a VIF, that would be a difficult scenario because it is going to keep on creating and then looping and then destroying once you turn it off, and then repeat the process again and again. Whereas if you use a VShow, it would only render the component once, it would loop the components once, and then it would simply turn the visibility on and off, therefore saving CPU power. So you won't be rendering and de-rendering the components all the time, so only simply showing and hiding them. So that saves a lot of CPU power. So there's actually a good or bad practice. It just depends on the use case scenario. So for the previous use case scenario, that is a good practice. But for the second use case scenario, the VIF is not a good practice. So it depends on the use case scenario for that. So I hope that answers your question. So thank you for that. Okay, so what time is it? 11:52. Okay, so I think we still have a few minutes to answer more questions. So you have any, please don't hesitate guys to leave questions. So we will be answering all of your questions. So please just keep them coming. Please don't be shy. Okay, let's see. There's still enough questions. So we will be, okay, so again, please don't hesitate. So just keep commenting. Oh, yes, so an airplane, it's an airplane. Yes, it's an airplane. Okay, so far there are no questions, okay? So let's see. So we still have a few minutes for that. So again guys, please don't forget to spread the word around regarding these trainings because it will allow us to help you guys learn VueJs as well as to reach new people or introduce these technologies to those who are not yet aware of them. So please don't hesitate to spread the word around regarding these trainings. Also, if you would like to get notified of our training or whenever our trainings go live, please don't hesitate to hit the subscribe button in our YouTube channel because we also post our live sessions there. Aside from that, we also upload our tutorials there on a per week, or every week we upload tutorials there, so you won't be missed out of those tutorials as well. So please don't hesitate to hit that subscribe button to get notified. So, are there questions so far? Okay, so for the afternoon session, we will be starting at 1 p.m. later. So we will be seeing you later there. So we still have 5 minutes. So okay. So again, for the afternoon session, we will be starting at 1 p.m. Okay. Also, the link for the afternoon session is provided in the comments section as well. So you can head over there to get notified or to visit the second session. So I think there are no more questions. I think okay. Okay, so there are no questions so far. I think we can close now. Still have 5 minutes. Yeah, I think we can end it here now. There are no more questions. Okay, so again guys, thank you for watching this basic training session for the morning session. So we will be seeing you for the next session, which is the advanced VueJs training or advanced VueJS topics, we will be seeing you later at 1 p.m. Okay? Again, thank you for watching. This is Joshua from Pixel8. See you later, Pixelators!